FiiO's BTR7 or Cayin's RU9. Both of them are very popular and very highly regarded Bluetooth or USB DAC amps designed to use with a phone primarily, and both have extra power in ports on the bottom if you want to drive more demanding headphones or IEMs, with FiiO sporting built-in EQ and a bunch of sophisticated features, but Cayin having built-in vacuum tubes. Yeah, well, that's quite a significant difference. So I listened carefully with both of these with a variety of different gear from IEMs to full-sized headphones, and here's my take. So by popular request, FiiO's BTR17 and Cayin's RU9, how do they compare? Well, both are, well, quite well known and quite popular. Well, Cayin calls this the ultimate dongle DAC. This is a dongle DAC and this is quite a bit bigger. But yeah, okay, humor aside, it is quite a substantial device and it does have a lot of power, with up to a watt of power, or a bit more actually, from especially in DC mode, because like the BTR17, it also has the option of not only Bluetooth but external power in. And in the case of FiiO, you have the optional desktop mode, which you can engage for more power, and you can actually conveniently switch it between, phone mode, which it will not charge via USB, PC mode where it will, and of course Bluetooth very readily on the side. And the RU9, it has the optional DC input if you want to have this as the DC input rather than battery charge, to use it as a pseudo desktop amp. Otherwise, probably the difference in Bluetooth is minimal, except that the FiiO's BTR17 does have aptX lossless, so that may be a consideration for you. I haven't tried aptX lossless yet. If you have, feel free to leave a comment and tell me how that went, as I've read mixed reports about whether it actually works reliably, and I don't really have faith that it's actually transmitting losslessly all the time, but that's something maybe I should investigate in the future. However, between them, there's two main factors, which is the functionality and, of course, the sound. And, well, the obvious one is, functionality-wise, the BTR17 has a lot. The obvious ones is the built-in PEQ, which is something, a programmable EQ, so you can set up to 10 different EQ profiles for even 10 different maybe IEMs, headphones, or different types of music, whatever you want to do. And that's something you don't really have in anything else, and that's one of FiiO's great advantages. But the thing you have in the RU9 is the Korg vacuum tube in there. It's actually, as has been pointed out, this is actually a single-ended device internally, but it has the final output is balanced through a phase splitter, but that's a whole issue, which is not particularly a major one. But having tube mode, you can actually make it sound a little bit more euphonic with the classic tube mode, which you can just see the C inside the tiny, tiny tube indicator in there. Means that it sets up the circuit such that you get a slightly with a slightly higher crosstalk. There's slightly more closed-in sound, a slightly more euphonic sound, whereas you have modern tube mode, which I can't remember if that's the next one on the list. It may well be. You may just be able to see the M there. That gives you a balance between the harmonics and having a wider soundstage, and then of course you have solid state mode where it runs the 4493 AKM DACs just as they are, without any tubes engaged. And both of them have a slightly different presentation. The RU9 of course has 99 volume steps, which you can switch in, although the one thing that bugs me slightly is the fact that the rotary encoder is not totally reliable about clicking, and that when the display is off, it doesn't turn the display on to indicate the volume, which I wish they'd put into the firmware. But anyway, the BTR17 does better, and I think FiiO is ahead in general electronics in that their stuff tends to work pretty reliably, except if you're an early adopter where, yeah, then you just have to wait for them to fix the glaring issues in the firmware, but that's not a major issue down the line. They also have an easier to read screen, which, as I've reached my proverbial half century in life, it is a nuisance to read the screen on something like these dongle DACs, but which uses the same kind of screen as Cayin's other stuff. And yeah, I do not like trying to read those. But so win to FiiO on that one. Of course, you have other things with the FiiO like car mode, where it powers on automatically if it receives power via USB, and a whole bunch of other features which I think generally feature-wise FiiO tends to win. But where the RU9 tends to win is that it has, well, first of all, it has more power, and of course can magnetically attach it to the back of your phone, whether you use Bluetooth or USB as you desire. But also the particular tube mode is something that you cannot EQ in harmonics. I mean, FiiO does have in some of their electronics, they have increased the level of harmonics, but it doesn't seem to be as much as you get actually out of tubes, so that you will get more of a tubey sound out of the RU9. The primary issue, of course, then becomes tonality and then power. Now, with the BTR17, people described it as sounding a little bit warm, I think, relative to FiiO's other gear. I mean, I just reviewed the QX13, which is probably, I don't want to say cold is quite the right word. I don't like the word cold. Cold to me reminds me of the old, I think it was the Q5, that old 4490 based, DAC amp thing, which was pretty big, and it just had that really edgy sound of the old 4490 in there, closer to what I'd call cold. The QX13 was actually maybe super sharp and clear sounding, and interestingly, as I probably mentioned in the review, the BTR17 does sound a little bit more forgiving in that way, a little bit proverbially warmer than the QX13, which was quite interesting. But I still wouldn't call it warm. I think my definition of warm is maybe quite a bit more warm than what people consider warm. But, I'm thinking Woo Audio to me is warm, whereas everyone's maybe something like the BTR17 is a touch warm. But all the same, I was pretty surprised by that, and I think that further still, the RU9 is definitely a little bit more warm, probably both in the solid state mode even, and especially the tube modes with the added harmonics in there. But the interesting difference was, and this is probably where it's worth talking about the volume, I could level match them because we have two different volume settings for the BTR17. We have the 60-step mode, which changes the volume by 1 decibel per step, and the 120, which is in at the moment, which does half decibel steps. And I could match it using that to the half decibel steps of the RU9, which it only has one, out of 100, where it's out of 120 here. That made for easy comparisons, only delayed by the fact that I had to switch headphones quickly between devices, but I could run them at the same time using Rune's grouping method, or I didn't try any tricky things like the useful feature this has, which is you can do USB to SPDIF output. I don't know if it works at the same time as the headphones, so I decided not to muck about with it. But if you're one of those odd people who needs, for example, coaxial digital input, well, this has that, whereas the BTR17 doesn't. So I'd probably say the RU9 is a little bit more, well, you can clip it to your phone, but it's also a pseudo, mini desktop amp, whereas the BTR17 is very definitely a Bluetooth device. So in doing so, some interesting things came up. Well, obviously, yeah, with the tube modes, the RU9 sounds a little bit warmer. But other aspects of this is I ran them with a variety of gear, everything from full-sized headphones, Dan Clark Audio, Sennheiser HD800s even, which I dragged out for this comparison, and my good old collection of various IEMs, some of my favorites being the good old Solaris, because they're very, very sensitive. That means that any hiss or anything, which these generally don't have in low gain, is going to be apparent. And of course, things like the A8000s. Actually, interestingly, if you're wondering about the A10000s from Final, I will be reviewing those once they're in production again. That's on my list because I really like the tuning of the A10000s, whereas the A8000s are a touch bright. And also the Solaris, especially with these new spiral dots, which have even more funky design in them, are a touch bright as well. Well, I should probably change tip to something a little bit more narrow bore. But anyway, that means any harshness or edginess from these devices is going to be very noticeable with these IEMs especially. And any demands on the headphone amplification that kind of are pushing their limits are going to be noticeable with full-sized headphones. Something worth considering is that because these devices are small, they cannot hold a large degree of capacitance, which is really necessary for good performance, which you always have in something like a desktop amplifier, which can hold large degrees of capacitance. So that means that they do tend to get strained as you head towards their power limits. And that's why I used headphones to test them as well. I don't imagine people will primarily be using these with full-sized headphones, but maybe more the Cayin RU9 rather than the BTR17. But who knows? People do all sorts of interesting things. I can wander around the house and want something with Bluetooth to listen to music with, so I thought I'd mention it anyway. That's where some interesting things came up. Now, I won't mention music too specifically because it was a fairly general enough thing that it's, of course, if you have music with a lot of drums, for example, that's going to have more dynamics which put strain on the amplification than something like a small classical ensemble. And in that, I found that the resolution and dynamics from the BTR17 were better overall than the RU9 at the same volume. So switching, of course, IEMs or headphones, anything between them, I felt that I could hear better note decay and more nuances in notes from the BTR17 than I could the RU9. The RU9 was a little bit more forgiving, and where it won out, of course, is whether you have slightly more harmonic, slightly more forgiving sound, but also when you started to get towards the highest volume levels. And for example, with say FiiO's Utopias, which I use for determining the resolution and the presentation of devices, I would have the RU9 at 44 out of 99 for the Utopias in high gain, and the BTR17 at 67 out of 120. Something like the Dan Clark Audio Expanse was at 75 out of 99 for the RU9 and 107 out of 120 for in the BTR17 at a moderate volume level, which is probably somewhere around late 70s, somewhere around 80 dBs approximately. At least I usually tested that with a minus 18 dB 1 kilohertz test tone for level matching. So that was an interesting thing. Once you started to get with the Expanse towards the maximum volume in these devices, that's when their power limitations started to hit. Now, I didn't get to clipping because they're designed not to get loud enough to clip really. And I didn't test with any crazy bass heavy music like movie soundtracks this time. But what tends to happen is because of the lack of capacitance, the soundstage tends to get a little bit more narrow, a bit more congested, and the amplification sounds a little bit more strained. It was holding it together with the Expanse, which was in kind of extreme test as they're fairly insensitive headphones. But probably the main thing is with some tracks where maybe the music was a touch sharp and edgy, and one that came to mind is Massive Attack's Ritual Spirit. That is where any kind of distortion in the music or edginess in the music, and a lot of modern recordings are a little bit too sharp and edgy for preference, that's where the strain in the amplification combined with that edginess tends to become a little bit uncomfortable. And so that's where the BTR17 started to become more strained as it got towards maximum volume than the RU9, which, because it has the extra power available, especially when you have DC mode, even using DC mode and desktop mode with the BTR17, once you started to get towards the maximum, well, yeah, 660 milliwatts versus over 1 watt, well, that's where you started to notice it. The Cayin RU9 sounded less strained as you got there than the BTR17 under that kind of situation. Now, of course, with IEMs, it was generally down to detail, resolution, and maybe the slightly sharper sound of the BTR17 was maybe better in some ways, but when you have maybe a synergy factor with brighter IEMs, which you tend to get a lot of IEMs which are more V-shaped or brighter or whatever, and often have to tone down the treble, or you have a lot of balanced armature IEMs still, which do have that slight distortion, which can be a little bit irritating depending on the setup, etc. That's when maybe slightly sharper sounding gear like the BTR17 is less desirable, and slightly more forgiving gear like the RU9 works better. So overall, I reckon that between both of them, that if you want portability, Bluetooth focus, aptX lossless, features, etc., etc., you have car mode, the PEQ, functionality wise, my head goes for the BTR17, and it's probably, I would say, more resolving than the RU9. However, the RU9 has such a soft spot for me. It's one of those devices that if I want to go and pick up something to listen with and not think about listening with, then I'm more likely to pick up an RU9, even though it has worse battery life, as little as 3 hours, depending if you set up tube modes, high gain, etc., and higher volume, whereas the BTR17 is longer, but you have less power, and depending on what your setup, maybe more potential for running into its limits. Still, I'd probably say like the RU9 is something that you might snap to the back of your phone for a couple of hours wandering around the house, and then it may be something you might plug in DC mode as it's got a pseudo desktop device. Whereas the BTR17 is something that, especially with things like the auto battery limiter to preserve the battery, you can take it around with you. You don't have to think about it, and it has plenty of options. So it's kind of head BTR17, heart RU9, and that's probably the overall difference between them. Now, of course, I'd like to invite you, if you have either of these devices or have compared them, or have noticed any particular things that maybe I haven't noticed, to leave a comment below, as not only will I find that very interesting and helpful for me in improving my reviews, but people who are looking to buy either of these devices will find that helpful as well, to get comments from actual users who use them regularly, which is something I do not. As always, I really appreciate that you took the time to get this far and watch this video, and I hope to chat with you online, or if you do see me at one of the Can Jams, do say hi, as I look forward to chatting with you.